Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and the Zionist Organization of America is privileged to host Professor Gerald Steinberg, president of NGO Monitor, who will be speaking on NGOs Exposed, How Unchecked NGOs Are a Threat to Israeli Democracy. Those who blindly repeat and echo false claims of an anti-democratic wave in Israel are again applying double standards and using false claims in order to isolate and condemn the Jewish nation state as part of the ongoing ideological and cynical campaign of delegitimization. The exploitation of the language of democracy as a weapon to promote campaigns by narrow opposition groups empowered through secret funding processes and not subject to any checks and balances is the real threat to Israeli democracy. This paragraph is taken from an article that I have printed out that Professor Steinberg wrote in that new newspaper. What's it called? The Israeli Times? Yeah, it's wonderful. And I have copies in the back, so if you want it, it's there. NGO Monitor, a Jerusalem-based research institution, provides information and analysis, promotes accountability, and supports discussion on the reports and activities of political advocacy NGOs claiming to advance human rights and humanitarian agendas in the framework of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Gerald Steinberg is president of NGO Monitor and professor of political science at Bar-Ilan University. A renowned scholar and public speaker on Middle East issues, Steinberg's op-eds have been published in the Wall Street Journal in Europe, Financial Times, Haaretz, Jerusalem Post, and other publications. He has appeared as a commentator on CNN, BBC, CBC, and NPR, and has addressed the Israeli Knesset and the European Parliament. He is the co-editor of the recently published The Goldstone Report, Reconsidered: A Critical Analysis, a comprehensive assessment of the UN report on the 2009 Gaza war. At this time, kindly turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices. It is my honor to introduce Professor Steinberg.
I have to admit the issues that I deal with it's very hard to find something humorous in them. These are very deadly, serious issues. When I talk at universities, as I did today at UCLA or other places, either I'm automatically greeted with hostility, or people say, well, these are issues of human rights and Amnesty International, all these organizations, how could they possibly be a threat to Israel? It's what's called soft power, and it's something that the Jewish people, Israel in particular, really weren't used to dealing with until recently. Unfortunately, we've had to deal with major direct attacks against the survival of the Jewish people, against Israel, tanks and aircraft and missiles and fear of threat of chemical weapons. But in some ways, in many ways, in most ways, what we call the assault on Israel's legitimacy, the rejection of the right of the Jewish people to have their own state and calling it racist, apartheid. Next week is something called Israel Apartheid Week on many campuses. The allegations in what was called the Goldstone Report of Israeli war crimes, hundreds of war crimes, making hundreds of Israelis, maybe thousands, labeling them as war criminals for defending against terrorism. That's a far more insidious, erosive, and immoral type of attack. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, not to depress you. I think we're all depressed enough about this, but also to talk about serious ways of defeating this war. And otherwise I wouldn't be doing this. I wouldn't be here this evening. I wouldn't ask you to come out tonight. We wouldn't be working with the ZOA and the Children of Holocaust Survivors on these important issues together if we didn't have a set of tactics and strategies, just as they have to be used in a military war, also in the soft power war. And I'm wrong button, not the right button. I'm going to take you back to Durban, South Africa, September 2001, over 10 years ago. This picture captures what, in many ways, this is all about. Thousands of people marching. They were given placards and T-shirts. South Africa, they had no idea what Israel was really about. But there was a conference run by the United Nations. It was supposed to celebrate the end of apartheid. The United Nations Conference on the Elimination of Discrimination and Racism around the world. Over 1,500 organizations were brought there by the United Nations and various European governments, the Ford Foundation. And this whole conference, 1,500 organizations, 5,000 roughly delegates. What was the one thing they all agreed on? They didn't really agree on it. The one thing that was shoved down their throats. The process was manipulated cynically from the beginning to the end through the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And I use that, if I had quotes, those of you would see the big quotes. This is the language that all those organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and a group of Israeli, large number of Palestinian and European groups adopted. Look how many times the word apartheid appears there, racist, war crimes, ethnic cleansing. And the bottom line, the strategy, what's called the Durban strategy that was adopted, very explicitly call on the international community to impose a policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. That's what the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is about. And I'll give you illustrations. That's what Israel Apartheid Week is about. That's what the war crimes allegations, the Goldstone report, they all come out of this. All the language is there in 3 lines. Says it very explicitly. This is what we're going to do. 11 years ago, and they set about doing it. The process is predictable, it's simple, and it's been quite effective. Whether it's for want of a better word, the lie, the accusation, the false accusation. It was a straight-out lie that Israeli soldiers massacred Palestinians in Jenin. Or whether it's the Goldstone report on Gaza and the war crimes allegations, or there are at least 8 or 10 different examples where we go through this process. Non-governmental organizations, human rights groups, groups that say we are a moral, idealist organization committed to universal values, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the names that they've adopted for themselves. We find Israel guilty of all these accusations. In Jenin, Israelis were being blown up and killed by the dozens in 2001, 2002. Bus bombings and restaurant bombings and the Passover, the terrible park hotel bombings, and so many other terrible examples. And the Israeli military, after waiting and after being told this was by the Bush administration and Secretary of State Colin Powell, don't go in, don't do anything militarily against these attacks, finally, after it became well past the point where it was unbearable, the Israeli military went in what was called Operation Defensive Shield into the Jenin refugee camp, which was the center of the suicide bombings. And the next day, the Palestinian spokespeople went on radio and television and said Israel's committing a massacre. They're ethnic cleansing, all those terms that were adopted a few months earlier in the Durban conference. The first non-Palestinian who said, yes, Israel's committing a massacre. And remember, there was absolutely no massacre there. On the contrary, Israeli soldiers were being killed because they were being careful. There was no use of aerial bombing to avoid Palestinian casualties, civilians. An Amnesty International official by the name of Derek Pounder went on the BBC and said, yes, yes, I can verify there was a massacre in Jenin. He was nowhere near there. But it was very much part of that process. And so you have dozens of organizations, Human Rights Watch, Israeli groups, many other groups, all reporting to the press and being picked up, whether it's the BBC or the New York Times or the Guardian or any other media outlet you can think of. And they're the experts. So the language of massacre in Jenin, or the language of war crimes in Gaza, or the language of excessive use of force and disproportionate force in Lebanon. Again, I can go through all these examples of the apartheid wall, which was the separation anti-terror barrier. These organizations introduce the vocabulary. They are seen as experts. And then the newspapers and the radio and the televisions all pick it up and copy it without any question. I can't tell you how many times I see in the newspapers. Human Rights Watch today issued a report, not just about Israel, but about any place. Amnesty International, the head of human rights, Ken Roth, said, and I asked my journalistic friends, serious reporters, in Yiddish there's a phrase, das hat gesucht, so he said, have you checked to see if there's any truth or accuracy? Does Ken Roth know anything at all about security, about terrorism, about military weapons, or any of the people who issue these reports? These are organizations, bless you, that 20 years ago were created 30 years ago for prisoners of conscience, for other causes during the Cold War. And they have transformed themselves into these experts on issues of which they know nothing about. But the media treats them, without any question, we call it the halo effect, as experts. And then the CNN reports, the BBC reports, the New York Times headlines create enough of a political process, it's called the CNN effect, it goes back to the Gulf War and earlier, that the diplomats and the politicians are asked questions, press conferences, or they speak out. During the Gaza War and other cases, the Lebanon War, during the Bush administration, it was the people in the Bush administration. It was Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice who would often get on radio and television and criticize or condemn Israel on the basis of these reports. Accusations of war crimes which had no substance. They were fabrications, they were political fabrications, and I'll talk a little bit about why this happens. And then, of course, my colleagues at universities and law schools where they teach human rights and write about human rights, most of the people who write about these issues have never been on a battlefield. Most of them know nothing about what they're supposedly writing about. And yet they take these reports. I can't tell you how many course syllabi I've looked at on international law and human rights, where you see a report by Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch as part of the syllabus. Or you read a book about conflict, Russia, Georgia, Sri Lanka, Israeli-Palestinian, Gaza. And the footnotes in the academic books are from these same reports, which never had any content in the first place. Or they may quote Condoleezza Rice, who's actually citing a newspaper report, who's actually quoting an NGO report, which has no substance. It's a huge business. And it's cynically manipulated, and it does tremendous damage. It does tremendous damage to Israel as the main focus, the target, it's literally a target. It does damage to the United States in dealing with terrorism. But primarily it does damage to this moral principle of universal human rights. It cheapens it, it destroys it. It removes the moral framework. The Goldstone process is the most virulent example of this. I mentioned Jenin, I mentioned the separation barrier that was named the apartheid wall, the Lebanon War. All these reports happened one after the other. But clearly the major success, if you want, of these organizations is to get a prominent Jewish judge by the name of Richard Goldstone to put his name on one of these fabricated reports. The Gaza War took place, began in December of 2008 after hundreds of rockets, every one of which is a war crime were fired from Gaza at Israeli civilians. And after the international community, whatever that may mean, didn't do anything, Israel was forced to go in and defend its citizens. And I always ask critics of Israel, well, if you lived in San Diego or Los Angeles, you're close to the Mexican border. Let's say Mexico was taken over by a group like Hamas. And they started bombarding your cities with rockets, mortars, sending suicide bomb squads to kill you. How long would it take before the U.S. government would respond? An hour? 15 minutes? Minute and a half? Israel waited and waited and waited because the international community was going to stop this, and they didn't do anything. The whole mechanism of hundreds of NGOs was absolutely ready in place for the soft war assault on Israel as soon as Israel went into Gaza. They had the press releases written in advance. Every single day, practically every hour, they issued condemnations of Israel. They had no idea what was going on, just as they didn't know what was going on in Jenin. But they were ready with the condemnations. They had somebody, Human Rights Watch had what they called their senior military analyst, a gentleman by the name of Mark Garlasco, who wrote a lot of these reports. One senior military analyst for Human Rights Watch, whose military record is very unclear as to what kind of an expert he might have been, who collected Nazi war memorabilia on the side as a hobby obsessively. He wrote these reports, and he's sitting on a hill in Israel, writing reports on a smartphone and sending them out of Israeli war crimes. What's absurd is not that he was doing it. What's absurd is that anybody took it seriously. You sending this off now as a dispatch? The fact that it was taken seriously and went through the whole system, the media, the press, the diplomats, there are hundreds of reports like this that were written. And they were collected by Judge Goldstone under the auspices of the UN Human Rights Council. Let me say a couple words about the UN Human Rights Council. The Council itself, it's a UN body, and the way it's structured, the way it works, the way it sets its agenda, an organization called the Organization of the Islamic Conference, now it's called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, over 50 Islamic states, from Tehran to Cairo to Tunis, Syria, Algeria. The worst offenders in the human rights world run that council. So they will never talk about, there was not ever a conversation in the Human Rights Council about Gaddafi's war crimes or Assad's war crimes. Only now are some of them taking place. The only country that was named in the permanent agenda was Israel in Article 7. So you have the Islamic-controlled Human Rights Council, which is a farce, and its allies are all these non-governmental organizations that have offices and have very high-sounding officials sitting in Geneva, working with the appointees of this Human Rights Council controlled by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, ready and fully functioned, armed to the teeth to attack Israel. So here's the game. You attack Israel, you kill Israelis, and then when Israel tries to defend its citizens, then you yell war crimes, and you implement this whole mechanism, including now the International Criminal Court and various national courts, all of which are lobbied by these NGOs to open up cases against Israelis. The Goldstone report contained over 500 references to these, 500 pages, sorry, to these NGOs, and hundreds of 500 pages, of which almost all the text was composed, I'm getting the jet lag is hitting, was almost entirely composed by NGOs. They say they investigated, Judge Goldstone talked about 36 incidents. There's no list. We now know the list was apparently supplied by Amnesty International, not any UN body, and who knows how they invented this list. To his credit, Judge Goldstone realized about a year plus later after the report came out that the claims that are made in this report could not withstand scrutiny. NGO Monitor played a very serious role in that process from the very first day, because we knew what was going to happen, in criticizing, in dismantling this farce of a report. And it took Judge Goldstone a while, but he acknowledged that, and he should get credit for that, because he's been lambasted and harassed and attacked by his allies, the other people on the Goldstone Commission and others, for having told the truth. But the damage is very serious, and one of the reasons that we put out a book called Goldstone Report Reconsidered is that in every law library in the country, in the world, there will be a counter to the Goldstone claims. The latest example is what was called the Free Gaza Flotilla. It was now about 2 years ago. The NGOs, again, they follow the same script. They had the press reports, the press releases, the attacks, the condemnations of Israel ready before anything happened, using language like collective punishment and piracy, violation of international law, committing murder. All these were written before the Israeli Navy intercepted this boat, which was violating the blockade against bringing weapons and forms of destruction to Hamas. That they weren't protesting that. They were protesting what Israel is doing to defend itself. The BDS movement is another manifestation of this: boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. They have campus activities. There was just one at the University of Pennsylvania quite regularly. They use symbols and posters which are blatantly anti-Semitic, like the blood orange. And again, you hear the language of colonialism and apartheid. This is where anti-Semitism merges. Classical anti-Semitism merges with what we call the new anti-Semitism. The symbols, the language, the same direction. By the way, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, I'd be happy to leave you a copy of it. Did I go too fast? The images say a lot. The Chinese expression of one picture's worth 1,000 words. We'll hear 2,000 very offensive words. Look at, these are two typical posters. The one on your left won a prize in 2010. Look at the anti-Semitic caricatures, the obvious, this could have been in Der Stürmer. This was produced by a non-governmental organization claiming to promote refugee rights and funded by 3 or 4, actually 6 different European governments. The Swiss, the Dutch, something called the NDC, and they were all involved at the Swiss, the Dutch, and 2 other countries, Austria maybe, the Danish government, and the Norwegians. Under humanitarian aid, mind you, they fund this. Now, to their credit, when they saw this, the Swiss stopped the funding. But it took our work at NGO Monitor to bring it to their attention. They're throwing millions and millions of euros and dollars at these organizations under the facade of human rights. And this is what they're getting, the exact opposite. The photo on your right was widely disseminated in English and Arabic, allegations of sexual harassment by Israeli soldiers. It's a completely fake photograph. My kids in the Israeli army look at it and they realize right away there's no such uniform structure. But what the image is by, this was by a group called Mada al-Carmel and a couple of other groups, funded by the European Union, the New Israel Fund, and George Soros' organization. And it is incitement to violence. When you allege sexual harassment by Israeli soldiers, what you're really saying is here's an excuse to use violence against Israelis. The money that fuels this it's just overwhelming. It's incomprehensible. We estimate 100 million euros of government money. This is not money that comes from Saudi Arabia. There may be that too. Or from the PLO or from any other Arab source. This is European taxpayer money, and unfortunately I have to say we're beginning to see now some American money going into this. The scale is very different. We just started a report. We've never done a serious report in the United States because under the Bush administration there was very little or no money going into that. That's changing. The amount of money, but most of it still comes from Europe. 100 million euros, we estimate. Approximately 100 groups, 50 Israeli groups, 50 Palestinian groups, and a few European groups, getting anywhere from $1 million to 2 or 3 or 5 million euros a year. The average comes out to be about $1 million per group from across Western Europe. This is not a Europe that has money to throw around last time I checked. They got other serious issues. The Spanish government gives at least €1 million a year. As I understand, they're next in line after Greece in terms of bailouts. The Irish government gives over $1 million to these organizations, sometimes under the facade of humanitarian aid, usually through church groups, sometimes under the facade of peace processes. In most cases, the governments have no idea, the leaders of the government have no idea where their money's going. We constantly ask ambassadors, diplomats, foreign ministers to explain why their money is being used for these posters. And usually the first reaction is, that's our money? We're doing that? Can't be. And then they find out that, yes, it is. At least we get their attention. The lawfare cases against Israeli soldiers. There are hundreds of Israeli soldiers on blacklists. Meaning that if they go to some of the European countries where there are warrants out or there will be investigations, they'll get their pictures taken as being investigated as war criminals. Spain, up until the last couple of months ago in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Here's a conference that took place in Cairo, broadcast on Al Jazeera. This is, and we took this as a screenshot from that conference, on the impunity and prosecution of Israeli war criminals. Sponsored by the European Union, the flag is behind there between the two speakers, and a group called Oxfam Novib, which is a Dutch humanitarian aid agency. That's where their money's going. All of these things are, we have a very good, very qualified, a very dedicated, small research staff, and we go through and find these things, and then we constantly get the response, that can't be right. Well, the evidence is right here. Now, I don't want to leave you depressed, and in fact I wouldn't be here, as I said, if I was depressed. We've had significant success on these issues. There's still maybe not 100 million. We've gotten a few million cut off of the amount. We have a lot more work to do. But we've certainly raised the questions. When the New York Times reporter gets these reports, they don't usually make it to the New York Times anymore. Because he realizes, and sometimes very often will consult and read our reports, that these are not experts, not in international law, not in military conflict, not in human rights. They're propagandists and ideologues with far too much money. And by undermining the ability of these organizations to promote these facades of moral values, by reclaiming those same moral values, we are beginning to make a difference in this process. I'll give you the examples. I think that's the best way to see this. They're not, when they write reports and they don't, for 4 years of captivity, no or almost no mention, not a single report. Human Rights Watch puts out reports that look like this constantly. They just had a report about a month ago making all sorts of allegations against Israel, again, most of which are fabricated. Not a single report on Gilad Shalit, the most blatant example of a human rights violation, because it doesn't fit into their ideological political goal, which is anti-Israel, anti-Western, anti-capitalist. They are not human rights activists. They are ideologues who seek to impose their political and ideological values and goals and get paid very well for it and can't get elected, so they go outside the political system through these organizations. The best way to deal with them is naming and shaming. They do not represent the moral claims that they put on their banners, but the opposite. To his credit, the founder of Human Rights Watch, Robert Bernstein, it took him a few years of a lot of harassment by me. The first time he said young man, he was in his 80s, so it worked for me. I'll give you 5 minutes. He gave me 10. But a year later, he gave me an hour and a half with some colleagues. And he's now left Human Rights Watch, formed a new organization called Advancing Human Rights. He wrote an article in the New York Times which shocked the donors and the leaders of Human Rights Watch, and they're still in shock, I think, because he condemned the organization that he founded for helping turn those that wished to turn Israel into a pariah state. They turned Israel into a pariah state, these organizations. And to be published in the New York Times, not exactly a right-wing conservative media framework, condemning the organization for violating its own principles is very significant. Excuse me. The steam that went behind the Durban conference, the money, the prestige, the expertise, was gone by 2009. It took us a lot of work. NGO Monitor was founded, I should take a step back and tell you something about the organization, but the Durban conference, the second Durban conference, shows what we were able to accomplish. After the first Durban conference, and I was asked to be part of the Israeli team when I realized that we had completely missed the boat and didn't know what we were doing, I decided that this was one piece of the puzzle that nobody was dealing with. There are some very good organizations out there. And I have to admit that when we talk to our donors, it's always something, it's a problem to say they have been approached by so many good organizations. There are media groups like Camera and Honest Reporting. There is the Palestinian Media Watch, Itamar Marcus. There's Memory, which monitors the broader Arab and Iranian media. But dealing with these organizations was a vacuum. And as I said, I was going to take a year off of my work at the university. That's been 10 years ago. Because there's so much work that needs to be done. And we organized, because we were founded following the Durban conference, we made it our business not to allow the second Durban conference. The UN has 2 or 3 conferences in sequence. Usually they're 5 years later. We delayed it for a few years. It was very controversial. We went to Geneva. We met with every ambassador that was not part of the organization of the Islamic Conference, presented the information. And mainly we made the point that this Durban process is a huge embarrassment. It's a waste of money, but it's worse than that. It completely strips away the moral values of human rights. When Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International put their names on that declaration I showed you at the beginning, they make a travesty of the very moral values that they were founded and claimed to promote. And to their credit, President Obama, right after he came into office, first it was the Canadians. The Canadians have now led the way to restoring the moral values of human rights by cutting off all their money that they spent on these groups and also insisting on a consistent moral position, whether it's in the Human Rights Council or the UN bodies or any place else. So the Canadians were the first to say, we are not going to Durban 2. Then I believe the Italians and others pulled out. I don't remember the sequence, the Czechs. And then President Obama pulled out, and that was not easy because it was in the first couple months of his administration to make that decision, and there was a lot of lobbying within his administration and by those who supported him to go to the second Durban conference. And he made the right decision, the morally right decision to do that, to stay away, because there was no chance of convincing people who are not open to being convinced, who are not open to the facts, that go in to find Israel guilty, to find democracies defending themselves against terrorism as guilty of human rights violations. There's no way you're going to convince people who are so close-minded to look at the details. And then after that, a number of other countries walked out, and then Ahmadinejad came, in any case, made the whole thing exposed it as the farce that it was, and to be named in an article by a radical supporter of the whole process by the name of Naomi Klein in Canada as one of the generals of the Six-Day Durban War, I take that as a good battlefield medal for accomplishment. The Goldstone withdrawal, just as Robert Bernstein did, Richard Goldstone this time in the Washington Post, reconsidered, wrote an article basically recanting the main point of the report that has his name. When saying, if I had known then what I know now, the Goldstone report would have been a different document, it says, those NGOs that I relied upon, including Human Rights Watch, where Goldstone was a member of the board and close to Kenneth Roth, they really didn't know anything because what they told me was wrong. And I don't want to speak for his words, as he chose his words carefully, but had I known then what I know now, the Goldstone report would have been a different document, says a great deal. And the rest of the words continue in that. Civilians were not intentionally targeted as a matter of policy. That is the blood libel. That is the essence of all of these claims, that Israel is deliberately killing civilians. And here's Judge Goldstone saying it's a lie. That's very, very important. Damage is done, and a lot of people say, well, he's never going to be able to undo the damage. That's true, but it could have been a lot worse. And it does set an important precedent. And when the UN appointed a commission to investigate the flotilla, it was a completely different process, where Israeli positions were taken seriously. It wasn't a kangaroo court. And that time Israel cooperated because they knew that they would be listened to. The Goldstone report, the farce that it ended up in, and Goldstone's admission, to me, marks a turning point. And Goldstone, to his credit, also recently published an article in the New York Times condemning the apartheid slander. That's a huge change for him, and he should be given credit for that. The judge, the South African judge in the transitional constitutional court that went away from apartheid, to condemn the exploitation of the word apartheid against Israel is a very powerful voice. And I'm glad to say that we played a major role in that process. Finally, or almost finally, it's essential to follow the money. That I talked about the 100 million euros that's fueling this. I'll give you one example. There are hundreds of these examples. Each one requires a lot of research because they're carefully buried. Electronic Intifada is one of the worst of the organizations out there. The head of it, Ali Abunimah, soon to be appearing at a campus near you. If not, I don't think he's going to be at Harvard next week for the Israel Apartheid Week. One state conference, which means wipe Israel off the map. There is nothing more immoral and anti-human rights in this organization, this individual. Where does he get his money? What allows him to go around the world, him and an entourage, having these conferences? That's part of our job. That's what NGO Monitor does. We found it. We found it hidden in a church humanitarian aid group called ICO, which the Dutch government provides with a budget annually of 100 million euros a year. Most Western European governments outsource their humanitarian aid budget around the world. They provide a lump sum and say, you take care of this for us. You be our conscience, you go and take care of the poor. And the argument is that governments are not good at doing it, but churches are very good. But churches come always with baggage. And in Europe, part of that baggage is a lot of virulent anti-Israel and sometimes anti-Semitic frameworks and individuals. Inside Electronic Intifada, inside the Middle East Division, inside, you finally get to the Palestinian desk. And the head of the Palestinian desk writes for Electronic Intifada. She's giving away Dutch taxpayers' money to Electronic Intifada while she writes for the organization. And that's it. There is no report to the Dutch Parliament. There's no debate in the Dutch Parliament. There's no media coverage of this. In any other country, this would be considered to be a blatant conflict of interest, beyond the immorality of writing for an organization which calls for the elimination of the State of Israel. And when we found this, by carefully exploring and looking for the information, we found the money that's given by this organization, by ICO, Dutch government money. And we presented it to the foreign minister, and it was taken seriously. It got into the media, and there's now, not just Electronic Intifada, but throughout the Dutch government, there's an investigation how much more of this is going on. There are a number of other governments that have followed similar processes. The British government has cut back on some of its funding. The Swiss government has cut back, as I said, on Badil. The Swedish government either cut or froze funding for a particularly virulent organization. You open up the can of worms and others come out. The naming and shaming, the following the money, there's an organization. The New Israel Fund, unfortunately, also provides significant amounts of money. A few days ago, this is hot off the press, as part of NGO Monitor's daily monitoring, we literally every day put out a summary, an internal summary of where these activities are taking place and who's doing it. And we saw this poster sent to us actually by a colleague from UN Watch in Geneva on the annual Israel Apartheid Conference that was taking place in Geneva last week. And one of the main speakers was a woman, representative, legal representative from an organization called Adala. Well, Adala's funders are European governments, the New Israel Fund. And they immediately went on the defensive because this contradicts their mandate and their guidelines. As far as we know, Suhad Bishara did not speak. We don't know because nobody did a live streaming of it. We checked a couple of the stills. We asked people who were there. They said they weren't there. They were going to be there until we blew the whistle. And that's a very important difference. It says, the game that you used to play from Durban until now is over. You want to support apartheid, then don't say that you're for a two-state solution, if you're for peace, and you accept the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination. The minute you use the term apartheid, the minute you support BDS, you're calling for the elimination of the Jewish people, the modern anti-Semitism, or the elimination of the Jewish state, rather. The book that we produced on the Goldstone report is now in hundreds of campuses around the world, law schools. One of the reasons we produced it, not just because they had the Goldstone report, but because Naomi Klein and others had written a ringing endorsement using pseudo-legalistic and moral language, also called the Goldstone report. And we felt it was necessary that make sure that every law student who looks up and studies the Goldstone report will see the book. The electronic version will come out soon, so people can download it, and they'll have it. It'll be available in every possible way as a historical document to at least attempt to right this wrong. Finally, what we do, and this is something that, this is where you bring the audience into this. That's actually not what I was going to say, but it works. This is our website, that box there which says EU funding changes around different major publications. But we make this information available. We bring out from the underground what these organizations try to keep hidden. We provide the analysis. We provide it to the same journalists that are used to getting hand-fed the reports of the NGOs. We provide it to the governments and the officials, the ambassadors who say to me, I didn't know our government was funding this, and I think it's honest. They don't know because of the way in which the money is manipulated and handled. They should know, and now that they know that we know, they're going to be more careful. So we put material on our website every day. We can monitor at least 150 organizations. The kind of hate mail we get, the type of attacks that we get. An article today in the Jerusalem Post, I don't usually read the talkbacks, but I read them. The vitriol. We're doing our job. We're out there. We're making a difference.
What influence do you think you've had on the Israeli government and the law that's potentially up for grabs, but is in its second reading?
We've had, I think, a very major influence on the Israeli government because we brought this to the attention of Israelis, including government officials, including the Knesset. I've been to lots of Knesset meetings and met with many, many members of the Knesset. The laws are problematic. We did work with members of the Knesset and provided the information for the NGO transparency law that was adopted a year ago. And that was extremely important, and now we're only beginning now to see some of the impacts. But some members of the Knesset, in my view, wanted to do more and in trying to limit the NGOs, and did not recognize the complexity of the issues. And it was the Prime Minister who withdrew the law from the proposals from consideration. They're going to be rewritten more carefully so they'll withstand court processes and not be easily interpreted as simply an attack on these wonderful organizations. It was too easy a gift for them to turn them into martyrs. So the language has to be more carefully written. And in some ways, my view is that you don't really need to have laws. When the groups are exposed as being frauds, they lose their support. When they are being legislated against, then they play the martyr. So one has to be careful of the political context, and in my view, that wasn't considered enough when these laws were originally introduced. I think the next time there will be more understanding and caution. There is a great, I should say, when the Israelis began to see how they were being manipulated by this 100 million euros a year, that's what, $134 million a year in an Israeli economy, all going to one narrow part, radical part of the political spectrum, calling Israelis war criminals and guilty of apartheid and racism. That made Israelis very angry across the political spectrum. This wasn't just the far right. And that was the trigger for these legislative attempts.
Very nice presentation. I enjoyed it. And
you're not supposed to enjoy it. It's supposed to trouble you.
Two questions. One, when does an NGO become a gongo? And
he knows the language. I'm in trouble.
Talk more about George Soros.
Okay. The word gongo, there's a lot. An NGO is supposed to be, this is not an academic lecture, so I didn't bring this up, but since you asked the question. Non-governmental organization. Sounds great, right? They do wonderful good things. It's like the Kiwanis Club and other things, and then the Rotary. And that's why they have the halo effect. There are tens of thousands of these in the United States and around the world. There are many more. But it turns out that what are non-governmental organizations often get funding from governments. All that money that we just talked about. All these groups like B'Tselem and Adala and Breaking the Silence, they're funded by foreign governments. So not only are they gongos, government-funded, GO, the government, non-governmental organizations, but sometimes they're called fongos, which is foreign government-funded non-governmental organizations. Then there are quangos, which is quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations, and that's what I teach in a 14-week course. So, but it really does raise the basic principle of what do we mean by an NGO, a non-governmental organization, if its funding is done in secret by a foreign government. Very problematic. What was the second question you asked me? George Soros. I knew there was a reason. To be honest with you, we have a research program now, a fellow that's doing the research on the processes by which Soros's foundations give money. It's called OSI, many of them the Open Society Institutes. Who are the main people? What is the decision-making process like? We're not ready yet we just started that process, but using exactly the same careful research methods that we have, we expect to have a pretty serious report on him in 6 months or so.
I have a question. When you met with the founder of Human Rights Watch, and he appeared to be going through the process of sort of waking up, was he active during the whole period when HRW was doing all this fallacious stuff, and what did he have to say for himself when he finally sort of came around to, truth?
To look at the history of Human Rights Watch, it's a fascinating story. Robert Bernstein told part of that story in a Human Rights Day speech. I think it was at the University of Nebraska in Omaha, and the text is on our website if you want to look at it. I've written about it through the interviews with him, and there's some other sources. It is fascinating, and I can't do it justice in 30 seconds or a minute and answer. But what I will say is, to answer the question directly, no, he was not involved. He had retired. He founded Human Rights Watch at the time in the 1970s when he was the head of Random House. And he went to the Soviet Union and made deals to translate and met Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn and others, and felt that this was an example of someone who actually acted morally. He didn't act for his own personal interest, that something had to be done to help these people. But then, as the Cold War ended and he retired, and he said he did not follow it. To the degree he was involved in China. And it was only as we began to show him the details of how far his organization had strayed from the principles that he had founded it for, not he, but and others. It wasn't just him. He brought others with him as well. And you can see the anger that he discovered in that process. And that's part of the problem of NGOs. NGOs tend to be secretive. The head of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, has been there since the mid-1990s. There are no elections. There's no debate. There's no contest. There's no nothing. Amnesty International, Irene Khan, was there until recently for a particularly long time. I don't remember, it was 10 years plus minus. So these are organizations which generally tend to be run in a very secretive way from the top down with a huge amount of power. And the facade of liberal, progressive, and open is very rarely challenged. And that's part of the problem.
I have two questions for you.
I can only handle one at a time, as you just saw. So.
I'll try to remember the second one. The two organizations, one is J Street, and where does it fit? And the second one is BDS, which I think the original founder of that has just come out with some statements just recently in the newspaper. And I just wonder what your...
Okay, I think you're talking about Omar Margouti, who was the founder of BDS, who also claims to be a doctoral student at Tel Aviv University. This is more than cutting off the branch that you sit on. I don't know what the right language is. Yes, and he just reaffirmed, yes, the goal of BDS is against the state of Israel. It's not to change Israeli policy on the West Bank. It's that Israel should not exist. I have to be honest with you, to me, J Street is an enigma. I know that the founder, Jeremy Ben-Ami, has been involved in the New Israel Fund network in Israel before, and from what I see, it's a one-man operation that appeals to students who have, young people who have grown up with this morality and ideology and don't understand how they have basically been tricked and fooled through a facade. It doesn't seem to be that J Street is able to function the way that many organizations were concerned that it would. It doesn't seem to have the entree to the Obama White House that it originally had. Its conferences are becoming thinner and thinner in terms of substance. So it's part of a process that needs to be addressed carefully, but it may have been its impact may have been overstated. Certainly from where I sit, which is far away, it doesn't seem to have that very much pull. If you got the microphone, okay. You run the show, right?
I understand why the Islamic organizations are against Israel, but why are all these other organizations worldwide, including Europe and the campuses, why do they hate Israel so much? What is their motivation?
There are 3 or 4 major factors that come together. Again, this is one of those things when you put together a talk, you can't do everything. They'll come up in the questions. When I do my classes, I devote a couple long classes to this. So I'm going to telescope, but there are 3 or 4 major factors. Because I teach politics, I've done it for 30 years already, wow. But one of the main principles I have is if something important, it can't just be from one factor. There's usually a group of factors that build on each other. NGOs, people who spend their lives in non-governmental organizations, tend to have an ideology which is anti-government. They know better than governments, than democracies. They are the truth speakers of morality. And so that you come in with a built-in ideology, which is in academic terms is called post-colonial ideology, that Western governments, in particular capitalist governments, are responsible for colonialism around the world. There are victims. Whatever they do, they're victims. It's very patronizing. Palestinians can't be war criminals because they're Palestinians, they're victims. We don't expect them, these people say, to behave by the rules of international law. You read Ken Ross' absurd statements when Israelis were being blown up and they weren't writing reports and saying, well, international law only applies to states, it doesn't apply to terrorist groups. Morality doesn't count if you're not a state. You see this very deeply held ideology against, again, Western societies, democracies, the United States. Israel becomes part of that process. And that's a very major factor, and we've looked at the language that's used, and you see this post-colonial jargon that's there. So that's one factor. They're also anti-nationalist, post-nationalist, so they call themselves. Zionism is a form of nationalism, which they gets a black mark in any case from them. That's another factor. In Europe, you get also a layer of anti-Semitism. So I showed you the blood orange. I could do a whole session now on Christmas cards from humanitarian organizations, Christian Aid, War on Want, where you have the theme of Jesus and Bethlehem, and the Israeli soldiers are attacking the Jesus-like figure on the donkey, but it's in modern times, you know, with the at the apartheid wall. All those themes are there. Bethlehem at Christmas time, and there you see and you hear. It's not just the Christmas cards. We see many other pieces of examples of that in Europe, UK, and in Europe, residual Christian anti-Semitism, which feeds into all the other factors that I talked about. And the other factor is that there's a huge amount of money in this. Being part of this pseudo, is even a mild term, of human rights framework, being able to speak in Geneva, at the UN, at the meetings of the Human Rights Council, where you sit with the delegates and leaders of the world and you are seen as the embodiment of human rights. You can only do that if you're friends with Gaddafi. Human Rights Watch, and this is one of the most absurd things, Sarah Leah Winston, who was appointed by Ken Roth to be the head of the Middle East Division, went to Libya, held a press conference, wrote articles about the reforms of the Gaddafi government, and Saif al-Islam Gaddafi as a human rights reformer. I think this was 2007, 2009. And they were quoted when the London School of Economics had an internal investigation. How was it that we were suckered into accepting these millions of euros or pounds for a special program and giving Saif al-Islam Gaddafi a doctorate? Not honorary doctorate, but a real doctorate. And they said, well, they were reformers because Human Rights Watch said they were reformers. This alliance between the anti-Israel Arab and Muslim states that brought us Durban and brought us the Gaddafi reform movement, and I give you many other examples, are going to Saudi Arabia. Can you imagine this? A human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, Sarah Leah Winston, goes to Saudi Arabia. She doesn't go there to talk about women not being able to drive, or oppression of minorities, or people who have their hands cut off in the court procedures there. She went there to raise money from those same Saudi elites so they could persecute Israel. And she said it explicitly, and then they denied it. But we got the transcripts of the reports that were published in Arabic. So you have all these layers coming together. It's good business. They get good salaries. They get lots of PR and visibility. They go to Davos to speak to the White House, plus the ideology and the layer of anti-Semitism. You shouldn't now be enjoying this anymore. Good, because I'm going to fall on my face soon. One more question up here. He's been very patient after that.
Have you done any reports on Saudi Arabia and the other Islamic countries and how they're backing and funding these anti-Semitic groups? And also, do you know of any organization that's going to do a plan that's going to expose the horrific human rights abuses in these same countries that run around and say all this, say all these lies?
I think what we've seen in the last year, I don't want to say it's going to be a change because I remain very skeptical, but they've been forced to deal with the Syrian regime. Saudi Arabia, not yet. They do, on a pro forma basis, issue reports every 5 years. I don't remember. We have it in our summaries. A 35-page report is what I remember they issued on Syria 5 years, and something like that on Saudi Arabia. And they issue reports of 150 pages on Israel all the time. So these organizations which have failed are not going to reform in any serious manner. I do think that there are other organizations out there now that are beginning to pick up some of these messages. Bob Bernstein, who I mentioned, formed an organization called Advancing Human Rights, and they are active in this. Cyber dissidence is being the particular part of that spectrum. There is more focus on violation of human rights within the countries which are up until now taboo. One of the questions I have is whether there will be a reform of the Human Rights Council now that it's been exposed to such a farce. You no longer have Gaddafi there, you will no longer have Assad there, or the Egyptians or others. So this is an opportunity to turn the Human Rights Council into an organization that actually cares about human rights, as well as the NGOs that are their allies. I can say there's a plan there, but I can't say it's actually happening. And as far as exposing the funding goes, that's partly what we do and other organizations. And I think that the process, it's painstaking. You really have to follow the trail. And it took us quite a while, for instance, on electronic Intifada, to find where it's buried in the Dutch humanitarian aid funding, and to follow the track of the money that comes from Saudi and other donors, and from the Gaddafi Foundation. Took us a while to track some of that. But there's an understanding now that this is a way that there's a way to do this, and it needs to be done systematically. So I would say it's beginning to be a more widespread process. It's something that certainly we are trying to expand and to do more of, without trying to make it sound trivial or simple. It's just, it's carefully buried and needs to be quite a bit of research to dig it up.
Thank you very much.
This gentleman here has been very patient. Oh, okay. So I'm willing to give him one more shot if you are.
Does Israel just have a crappy PR department? I mean, why isn't there like a counter, to all this?
One question missing, and I
was wondering about that. And if you have any comments on the, the internet propaganda and how that works in this world, without 12-week course.
Huge questions, and it's not something that can be simply answered. In terms of the Israeli government, I would say most governments are not good at propaganda. One of the reasons is you have to be able to lie with a straight face. I mean, when I read some of these reports and hear the spokespeople for them get on, during the Lebanon and Gaza wars, I was on TV opposite some of these people from these organizations. And their ability to either lie or to invent things which they have no knowledge of was amazing. I just have to tell you this story. There was a Norwegian doctor that was part of the Norwegian aid framework. So government-funded, Norwegian government-funded, sent to Gaza to help the suffering Palestinians, reporting constantly of claims of Israeli war crimes. In the hospital where he worked, the Hamas headquarters was in the basement. And he would say, there's no sign of Hamas. We don't see anybody. This is just Israeli war crimes. There's no attacks. There are no missiles. The extent which you have to be, I don't know what the right word is. No, it's much worse than that. To be able to say things like, and I went off on Sky Television opposite him. What do you say after somebody says something which is so blatantly absurd, wrong, immoral? And he's a doctor, and he's funded by the Norwegian government. So governments who are serious government spokespeople have a great deal of trouble being able to confront that. And in some ways, it's better that it's being dealt with by... I have my own complaints. I think they can do a lot of things better. I won't go through the catalog now. But I also know what the limitations are. And I will suggest to you that you look at people who specialize more in internet hate, and I will avoid that question. We focus on this part of it. Believe me, that's more than enough to keep up an organization, a group of people busy. Thank you all. Good questions.
Thank you.
Good to see you all.